Well, hello, all of you. I haven't seen many of you in a long time, and I appreciate seeing all the familiar faces and you're bearing with me while I had to reschedule. That Monday, 2 weeks ago, as you know, Debbie came through and took out my electricity, and so the garage door could not open and the car could not come, and there were trees falling in my neighborhood. So I thought the best thing was to stay home. The recent death of former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in December of 2023 led to a lot of commentaries, a lot of opinions about her importance, the role she had played on the Supreme Court, how influential she was, and what difference it made that she was the first woman on the Supreme Court. To many people's surprise, O'Connor ended up being the crucial vote on several important cases. It was not something that had been predicted, and certainly had not been predicted by the man who nominated her to the Supreme Court, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, governor of California, had presidential ambitions. And he had done fairly well among women in the past. But as the prospect of the 1980 election loomed, he realized he had a problem, a big problem. It was called the gender gap. By 1980, more women were registering to vote than men, and they were voting in greater numbers. And Reagan's record on women's issues left a lot to be desired. He was opposed, of course, to abortion. He was opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. He hadn't appointed a single woman to any of the state court vacancies. And it was clear that if women voted against him, and they might, that his chances to become president were diminished. So Ronald Reagan had a problem. Stu Spencer, his chief strategist, has said, quote, "It was not an ideological decision at all. It was seeking a solution to his deficit problem with women." A representative from my home state, Margaret Heckler, had asked him, "Are you opposed to putting a woman on the Supreme Court?" And he had said, "Hell no, I'm not opposed." And so Spencer brought it up, Stu Spencer, his advisor, brought it up again and said to him directly, "Do you have any problem with nominating a woman to the Supreme Court?" And Reagan said, "No, if she's qualified." The timing of his announcement that he would appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, if elected, came in October. And it's interesting to look at when he announced this. He had been speaking to a group of coal and steel workers. He had been talking about environmental issues. And in true Reagan fashion, he blamed the trees for environmental problems. It was a gaffe, clearly a mistake. And they needed to immediately do something to take attention away from that. And so he announced that he intended to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. He said, "It is a time for a woman to sit among our highest jurists." What an understatement. 200 years? It was definitely time. As one commentator said, it was a bold and transformational move. And it just goes to show you that good things can sometimes result from cold political calculation, because that's what it was. Cold political calculation. Well, who was this woman he was going to nominate? Her name was Sandra Day, and she was the oldest of three children born in March of 1930 to Harry and Ada May Day. She grew up on a ranch, the Lazy Bee Ranch, 160,000 acres, one of the largest ranches in the country, one of the most successful. It was on the border between Arizona and New Mexico, 250 square miles, which is essentially 4 times the size of Washington, D.C. It was a harsh environment, an environment filled with desert, filled with rattlesnakes, filled with bobcats, a rocky terrain, coyotes, all kinds of wild animals. As Sandra Day O'Connor would write later, it was, quote, no place for sissies, unquote. Her father, who was an influence in her life, and here she is at age 12 and riding her horse at the Lazy Bee. Her father was kind but a perfectionist. And she told the story of when she was in high school, she drove the truck in the summer to bring the lunch to the cowboys on the range. And she got a flat tire. And she was very proud that it took her an hour, but she changed that flat tire, but she was an hour late showing up. And when she told her father about it, he didn't praise her. He said, you've got to be ready for any possibility on a ranch. That's who he was, and she took that lesson very, very well. She went to school actually in El Paso, where her grandmother lived, because the Lazy Bee was so remote. So from the time of elementary school through high school, she actually lived away from her parents, from her siblings, and attended school in El Paso. Okay. She was a very good student and ended up at Stanford University. She graduated high school at 16, skipping 2 grades along the way. That was the period when you could skip grades. And so at 16, she arrived at Stanford University. And she said she was not well prepared, but she was an outstanding student, influenced by one of her professors to consider maybe a career in law. And under a special program, she entered Stanford Law School at 19. And there she is in the front row, second from the left. You can see there were not many women in the Stanford law class of 1952. She graduated as a top student. In fact, she was on the law review. There's the law review. Again, look for her. She is on the left of the 2 young women pictured. She competed in the moot courts that are so common in law school, and her partner was William Rehnquist. They actually dated, and according to one source, Bill Rehnquist actually proposed marriage to her at one. However, she was not interested. She called, when she graduated from Stanford, at the top of her class, 40 law firms. looking for a job. None of them hired women. 1952, one company, one partners, gave her an interview, and when she got there, the question they asked her was, how fast can you type? So Sandra Day O'Connor would never have called herself a feminist. She didn't like that term, but very early on, she encountered gender discrimination. She talked about the fact that until she had joined the cattle drives on the ranch, it was totally male. And she had been the first to go on this cattle drive as a young woman. And that meant that inadvertently, she had started to poke at that very strict idea of proper gender roles. So she couldn't get a real job. She finally volunteered to work for the San Mateo attorney, free, without an office, just to get the experience. But she had gotten married in December of 1952 to John O'Connor, a fellow law student. Here's another photo. This was a very, very good marriage. He was extremely supportive of her career, as we'll see. And in 1954, John was drafted by the Army, and they ended up going to Germany, where he was in the Adjutant General's office as a civilian attorney. She volunteered her time in Germany, and then when they came back, they began their family. She had 3 sons, and this is a very nice photo of them when they're a little bit older. During this period, really in the early 60s, when they came back from Germany, she was not really active in law. She did a lot of volunteer work. She worked with a local Republican club. She volunteered with the Junior League. She drove her kids to various sports events. She got a copy of Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking and went through every single page. That's what she did. So she was not active in the law during this time. She really took a hiatus from it. And then she returned to work in the mid-1960s. She had the credentials. She had service to the Republican Party, and she was appointed as Assistant State Attorney General in 1965 in Arizona. And here's the certificate of her appointment. In 1969, just 4 years later, the Board of Supervisors of Maricopa County asked her to take a vacant seat in the Arizona Senate. So this is the beginning of her political career. Sandra Day O'Connor is very unusual among Supreme Court justices because there are very few that have this political career first. And she had a political career first. So she became Assistant Attorney General, and then the Senate, the Arizona Senate. After a while, and she was elected to 2 terms. Here she is taking the oath of office. If you're keeping track, she's now in her late 30s. And that was her election campaign to keep her in the Senate. She was asked by her colleagues to be majority leader of the Republicans in the Arizona Senate. First woman in the country to be a majority leader in a state Senate. She would hold social gatherings in her home. She was good at what she did, but as she would write later, and her son would confirm, state politics was really not her calling. She found that many of her colleagues didn't take things seriously. They didn't read the legislation. She was a stickler for detail. She once held up a bill because the comma was in the wrong place. And as one legal expert has said, she was too detailed. She was too analytical. She was too smart for the legislative process. There was one man who was head of the Appropriations Committee who often held up the bills, and he was a drunk. He would come to the legislative session at 10 o'clock in the morning, drunk. Finally, O'Connor confronted him and said, you know, this will not do. You're coming to the legislative session drunk. You have to change. And he said, you know, if you were a man, I would punch you. And she said, if you were a man, you would have done it. That was Sandra Day O'Connor. So here she has this political background, but then in 1974, early 40s now, she makes a pivot back into a legal career. She ran for the Maricopa Superior Court, and it's the beginning of her now choosing law over legislative politics. Although her experience, I would say to you, in politics really influenced how she approached the court, because she was very accustomed to working with other people, compromising, looking at things very, very carefully. Okay, she has now come full circle. Here she is as Arizona State Senate Majority Leader. She attended the Republican National Convention in Miami in 1972. That's her badge. But in 74, she became a Superior Court judge, and she did that for 5 years before she was appointed to the Arizona Court of Appeals. And you can see in this photo how many women were on the Arizona Court of Appeals. We're now at 1979. She talked about her experience on these courts, and she said it was, quote, 5 years of daily onslaught of human drama, burglaries, kidnappings, murders, divorce. It was like sitting all day in a soap opera. But she really understood. Think about it. She understood the human condition and what happens to people. Her reputation was fair, well-prepared, and tough. And then the call from Ronald Reagan. This is Sandra Day O'Connor with her husband John, surrounded by her 3 very proud, handsome sons after the nomination was announced. Of course, she was surrounded by the media immediately. The nomination was announced in July of 1981. And you better believe she was on the cover of most magazines, Arizona Republic, we're proud, Time magazine. Now, I have to tell you that the response to her nomination was mixed. It was mixed. There was both pro and con. The reason for that was there was controversy about positions she had taken formally, of course. She had voted way back when to decriminalize abortion, although the bill never came up for a full vote in Arizona. She had voted that way. And the right to life movement, the moral majority, which was very strong in Arizona, was absolutely against her because of this. On the other hand, there was the question of her position on the Equal Rights Amendment, which was also controversial. The opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment considered the Equal Rights Amendment anti-God, anti-family, anti-marriage, anti-everything else. And if you looked at her record, she had let the Equal Rights Amendment die in committee in Arizona when she was serving in the legislature. The feminists were very disappointed. They were angry at her. But if you look closely, she knew they didn't have the votes. She knew they didn't have the votes to get it out of committee. They didn't have the votes to pass it. So she let it die. But what did she do? Sandra Day O'Connor quietly made a list of every law in Arizona that discriminated against women, and she made sure they were overturned. So you had people on both sides against her, and the head of the National Organization for Women, Eleanor Smeal, said, quote, that Reagan's effort was simply to draw voters' attention away from essentially his anti-woman position. She arrived at Washington National Airport in July of 1981. If you're wondering, remember, she's just 51 years old. So that's young to be appointed to the court in general. And it meant that if she were appointed to the court, she could be there for decades. Here she is arriving, and here she is meeting with Ronald Reagan in the Rose Garden in July of 1981. And there she is at her confirmation hearings in September of 1981. It has been called, quote, the most talked about nomination ever, unquote. There were so many requests for the press to get in. It was even more than the Watergate hearings. It was the first time that a Supreme Court confirmation hearing had been on television. Millions of people watched it. There was a fascination with her, obviously. She was well prepared. She knew the kinds of questions the justices were going to ask. And she was confirmed by a vote of 99-0. Now, one woman commentator said this, and I find this a fascinating and disturbing comment. Sandra Day O'Connor is, quote, good looking without being alienatingly beautiful. She's bright without being alarmingly intellectual. Another political scientist said, what a savvy political pick. Here's this woman who looks like she could be in the local PTA. She's not about to overturn the apple cart and make men defensive. Now, maybe that's all true about Sandra Day O'Connor. Nobody's expectation was higher than her own. She knew what it was going to be like to be the first. She said, you can be the first, you don't want to be the last. And every time she opened her mouth when she was on the court to ask a question or give an opinion or have a dissent, everybody would be watching her. Close-up of her at the confirmation hearings, and here she is being sworn in by Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger. And by the way, when she arrived at the court, Chief Justice Burger handed her a memo. It was a memo that was a psychological study about what happens when women enter a group of male leaders. And the report said that men found it unsettling. So the women should be passive and quiet. She was stunned, absolutely stunned, but she was out to prove herself. Now you have to think about the time in which Sandra Day O'Connor landed on the court, 1981. It was a post-liberal court period. The court in the 60s and the 70s had done all kinds of things, striking down racial discrimination, affirming the right to abortion. It was a liberal court that had increased individual rights and the power of the federal government. And there was a backlash to this, of course, so that many very controversial cases were about to come to the court in the 1980s. So, and there she is in her chambers 10 days after she was sworn in. I'm admiring the baskets that she has on the wall, the Native American baskets, and of course, all the symbols from her home state, beloved home state of Arizona. To those who wanted the court to be more conservative, it looked like Reagan had made a good pick, because at the beginning, she aligned herself with Burger and Rehnquist and seemed to be emerging as a proponent of the new federalism. In other words, returning power to the states versus the federal government. And so people said, she's going to be a solid Republican conservative judge. But they really didn't know Sandra Day O'Connor when they said that. She was cautious, careful, thoughtful. She didn't like to be put into a box. Don't call her conservative. Don't call her liberal. Don't predict how she is going to come out in a certain case. She wanted to think every case through. And everything she did was going to be important, and she knew this. So here she is. That's the official photo, September 25th, 1981. Can you imagine how she felt? In color. And of course, the cartoons. Supreme Court locker room, here she comes. And this is one of the first cases that came before her in 1982. It had to do with a case about gender. It was Mississippi University for Women versus Hogan. What we're talking about is the Mississippi Women's College of Nursing. It was a single-sex institution, only for women. Okay, hear me again. Mr. Hogan lived very close to this nursing school, and he wanted to be admitted. Testing. Okay. So he wanted to be admitted to the nursing school because it was close, even though it was gender specific. The case worked its way through the court system and ended up in the Supreme Court. And O'Connor was the deciding vote here. She asked the lawyer for the Mississippi school, you have said that there is a demand for a single gender institution in nursing. Would you make the same argument if the demand was for an all-white, publicly funded state institution? Clearly not. So the vote was tied 4-4 at the Supreme Court conference, and the junior justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, had the last vote, and it was 5-4 to let men in. She was assigned to write the opinion, and she said very clearly, the exclusion of men from the nursing program is based on a stereotype of gender roles. She should know, shouldn't she? And it was against the Equal Protection Clause. So it was struck down. But, and here's where the caution comes in, this only applies to the nursing school. Now, this decision could have applied to any university, but that was O'Connor, the narrowest possible decision, and leaving room for further discussion. That was the way she approached Supreme Court cases. That was her philosophy. She didn't believe the court should start a revolution. She believed that much of this should be left up to legislatures to decide. After all, she came from a legislative background. So her decisions often are very carefully crafted to make sure that there's still room for discussion and further argument. She was a politician in the way she approached Supreme Court cases. Several years later, she and her husband went on a wonderful trip to China. Here she is with her husband, John. But the very next year, she came down with breast cancer. And that was a very hard time for her because Sandra Day O'Connor always considered herself strong and able to meet any challenge. And she didn't like the idea of not being in control. I don't think any of us do. And she didn't like the idea of being a victim. And so she timed her cancer treatments very carefully so she could still be on the court, and she wore a wig for much of the time. She liked to work out, and she had an aerobics class, and this was the t-shirt she personally designed, "Women Work Out in the Supreme Court." Now, there are many landmark cases that she was involved in, and I'm certainly not going to discuss all of them, but I will discuss the ones that are highlighted. The Webster versus Reproductive Health Services of 1989. And this was a case involving the Missouri law banning public funds used for abortion. or even to advise women about the possibility of abortion. It was one of the early attempts to strike down Roe v. Wade. And the court had already considered several cases involving abortion during O'Connor's tenure, and they had struck down restrictive laws. O'Connor had shown her willingness to allow restrictions as long as they didn't impose what she called an undue burden on the woman. And that became kind of the measure of where she stood in various abortion cases. So she knew she was in the middle of a firestorm. Conservative judges were replacing liberals all around the country. There was lots of angry mail that came to her, a lot of pressure, but the decision that came down upheld many of the restrictions that Missouri had passed, but it didn't go all the way in repealing the right to abortion in general. She wanted, as I said, the decisions to be as narrow as possible. Her ruling, or her opinion in this case, infuriated Justice Scalia. In fact, he did something that Supreme Court justices usually don't do. He publicly called her down and said that her reasoning couldn't be taken seriously. And his outburst may have helped to push her even more to the middle of the court. And that became apparent in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This is another abortion case in which Pennsylvania law required a woman wanting an abortion, to wait 24 hours, to undergo counseling, and to get parental consent if she was a minor, and her husband would have to be notified. And one of O'Connor's questions was, well, what if the woman didn't have a husband? You know, what does this case mean? So the conference on this case, and again, this is another case 30 years ago, trying to overturn Roe v. Wade. The conference, again, was tied, and it looked like abortion would be overturned, but then Sandra Day O'Connor, she played the middle ground. And the middle ground was affirming the right to abortion, but upholding some of the qualifications, some of the restrictions. And again, the undue burden should not be placed on a woman. That's how she felt. So O'Connor emerged increasingly, to everyone's surprise, as a swing vote on the Supreme Court, a pivotal vote. It was almost as if every hot issue that came to the Supreme Court, you had to look to Sandra Day O'Connor and see how she was going to decide it. She started being called the swing justice, which she did not like, but journalists referred to her as moderate, as a centrist, and pretty soon they began to call it the O'Connor Court, which was not something that people had expected at all. If you look at her judicial philosophy, it's very interesting. It's a case-by-case consideration, over and over again, careful, thoughtful, probing, not coming into the case with any preset ideas, even though she might have some personal opinions. I think personally, Sandra Day O'Connor did not really like the idea of abortion, but she came in with an open mind, looking at the reasoning of the case, listening to the arguments of the lawyers, and trying to decide on the merits of the case in the narrowest possible way. And that was her judicial philosophy. So if you want to call her a centrist or conservative, then it fits. She often would withhold her vote until she saw what the other 8 were going to do. And then she would come in and try and compromise and try and mediate and lend a very different opinion. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the second woman on the Supreme Court. They came from very, very different backgrounds, both educationally, how they were brought up, where they were brought up, different philosophies. Many of you know that RBG is one of my heroines. I stand in great admiration for her. So very different women, but they forged a bond because after all, they were the first 2 women on the court. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave a very famous decision in one of her first cases on the Supreme Court. Some of you may remember it. It was the Virginia Military Institute, which was an all-male, proudly so, bastion of military training, long tradition. And there was the question of admitting women to VMI. They struck down, the court struck down VMI's policy, and Sandra Day O'Connor was asked to give the opinion, and she said no. Ruth Bader Ginsburg should give the opinion because she came up with some of the most important arguments. And when Ruth Bader Ginsburg delivered the opinion, she paid tribute to Sandra Day O'Connor, and she said, you have to remember that it was Sandra Day O'Connor who had developed the argument that you may not close entrance gates based on fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females. And then she looked up and looked at Sandra Day O'Connor, and the 2 exchanged a glance. It was paying tribute to Sandra Day O'Connor from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was important. They were friends, and they had an important influence on the court. They often wore the same kind of special decoration on their robes. But then came the case for which there was no easy solution. The 2000 election, and by the way, we are going to teach a course on memorable presidential elections in the fall, and the 2000 election will be one of the lectures given by a former colleague of mine. The Bush v. Gore election, how can any of us who lived in Florida at that time forget it? George W. Bush versus Al Gore, a very close election, and it was up to Florida's 25 electoral votes. You all remember the hanging chads and the fact that there were probably 60,000 ballots that were incorrectly counted or that hadn't been tabulated. And there was a recount going on, but the court ruled that the recount should stop. I love this picture. So It was very controversial when the Supreme Court handed down their decision. It meant, of course, that the election would go to Bush. Sandra Day O'Connor knew that this was not an easy case, that it was a case, as she told her son, half the people in the United States are going to hate me after this decision is handed down. And many years later, when she gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune, she said, you know, maybe the court should have stayed out of it. It wasn't good for the Supreme Court to hand down this decision. But this was her reasoning. The state electors had already certified Bush. If there was a recount and the state electors certified Gore, what are you going to do? It's going to go through a process in which the Congress will get involved, and one house was Republican and one house was Democratic, and you'd end up with a tie again, and it would go back to the Florida governor to decide, who was Bush's brother. And she said, that'll make us look like a banana republic. And so she voted with the others to stop the recount. And, you know, it's one of those things where she wasn't sure the Supreme Court had done the right thing. In fact, on the family holiday card that year that they sent out from the O'Connors, the caption was, "May your new year be free from hanging chads." She resigned in 2005 before people expected her to. And she resigned because of her husband, John O'Connor, who was ill. As I said, it was a wonderful marriage in every way you can possibly think about. This is a picture I love, taken at the Meridian Ball in Washington, D.C. He was ill. He had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she resigned to take care of him. 3 months earlier, she had received the Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. There she is again. Many honors. This is one of my favorite, absolutely. The National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame in Fort Worth, Texas, has given her a special display. I'm sure she would appreciate that because she considers herself always, you know, a cowgirl. This is a bronze statue of O'Connor on display at the O'Connor United States Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona. You can't see it all, but she's depicted wearing her judicial robe, carrying a volume of US reports, and standing on shards of glass that represent the ceilings, the glass ceilings she shattered during her career. What did she do when she retired? First of all, she wrote books. Sandra Day O'Connor and her son, The Lazy Bee. Another book on the majesty of the law. She wrote 2 children's books. You might be surprised about that. And of course, there were books about her. The book by Evan Thomas, first, Sandra Day O'Connor, and then there's a wonderful book called Sisters-in-Law by Linda Hirschman about both O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But she was active, and she was active in starting a program devoted to civics education that I can only applaud. Her dedication to civics education was motivated by her awareness of its importance. She once said, without basic civic education, we can't expect to preserve or improve our system of government. The practice of democracy is not passed down through the gene pool. It has to be taught and learned by each new generation. The program was started in 2009. It's called iCivics. It's today the leading provider of and advocate for high quality, nonpartisan civic education. It's used by hundreds and thousands of educators to teach millions of students in all the states. Much of it is online now because that's, of course, how students learn. And before O'Connor retired from public life in 2018, she continued to call for making civic education a priority, saying we must arm today's young people with innovative civic education that is relevant to them. Bringing high quality civics to every school in every state is the only way that the next generations will become effective citizens and leaders. We have civics education here in Florida. We have a bill that was modeled after some of her goals. Here she is visiting a middle school class. And of course, she spoke at the Graham Center in 2011 about civics education. Bob Graham was also very interested in this. In 2012, there was a celebration of her appointment to the Supreme Court, and there she is, surrounded by the other women who were on the court at that time. From 1 to 4. And the same year she started the civics education project, she established something called the Institute for American Democracy. And the mission is to continue the legacy and lifetime work of Sandra Day O'Connor, to have multi-generational civics education, civil discourse, civic engagement. You can see her core values: civil, collaborative, fact-based, inclusive, nonpartisan, objective. Goodness, you're describing her approach to court cases. That's the way she was. And they have had wonderful speakers and conferences. I chose this particular slide, of course, because it talks about history as a source of strength. And there's David McCullough, who was a speaker in 2014. And then they have these special dinners. Dinner with Benjamin Franklin, featuring the great historian Walter Isaacson. Dinner with Frederick Douglass. David Blight was the speaker then. And what has she said about her importance? There is no doubt that my appointment to the Supreme Court was a signal of hope to women throughout America that their dream of sharing in the power base might be fulfilled. As women achieve power, the barriers will fall. As society sees what women can do, as women see what women can do, there will be more women out there doing things, and we'll all be better off for it. And of course, I had to show you these t-shirts. The Supremes. And there they are. And what a difference they've made. Yes, Sandra Day O'Connor made history, the first woman on the Supreme Court. Thank you very much for listening. And questions, comments, anecdotes?
Anecdote from Larry Lowenthal. I was one of the ballot counters back in 2001. I checked Chads on over 3,000 ballots. I examined them. If somebody interests you for your next presentation.
Okay.
Another question? Can you make it louder and say what you said? Louder?
Screaming at you. Okay. Back in 2001, I was a ballot counter, like you had a picture there. That could have been me in the picture. And I personally examined over 3,000 ballots, examining the Chads.
What a fun job. Examining the Chads.
Got money. I got paid for that.
Now, I have to tell you on a personal note that Sandra Day O'Connor turned out to be much more fascinating than I had initially realized. I mean, if you think about her background, it's very, very interesting and unusual for a Supreme Court justice. Anyone
Barbara,
else?
I have a question. Do you happen to know who the other woman in her Stanford law class was?
No, I don't. The question was, who was the other woman in her law class? And I don't know. I know there was a tiny percentage of women in law school at that time. Very small.
Need to check Zoom real quick. Yep.
There might be some questions online, so that's what we're checking right now. Okay, no questions. So I've stunned everyone into silence. Thank you so much for coming.